He said just 4 words, and the room froze. A little boy who had been through 7 foster homes suddenly points to the judge and calls her mom. "Subscribe. What city are you from?" Write in the comments. The courtroom hummed with the low murmur of routine. A shuffle of papers, the muted click of heels on tile, the rustle of suited bodies settling into their assigned places. From the bench, Judge Lacey Harper watched the scene with detached precision, her posture impeccable in her black robe, hands folded neatly over the case file that bore the number 12-0473 in bold, impersonal font. She blinked slowly, willing the weight behind her eyes to dissolve as she scanned the summary of the hearing ahead. Another dependency review, another failed placement, another broken piece of the system dumped back into her lap like an unwanted parcel. At 43, Lacey was known for her cold efficiency, a quality that had elevated her quickly through the ranks of family court. She was the judge assigned to the impossible cases, the ones that made seasoned lawyers quietly groan or sigh with resignation. Not because she was warm, quite the opposite. Lacey Harper didn't cry in court. She didn't bend under pressure. She processed children the way one might process data, clinically, precisely, with no wasted movement and no unnecessary sentiment. Her courtroom was calm, always, a kind of manufactured peace that came from everyone knowing there was no use in pleading to emotion here. Lacey didn't entertain sob stories. She looked for legal grounds. She weighed precedent. She demanded clarity. And yet, there were days when the weight of it all collected behind her sternum, a tight pressure that neither yoga nor red wine nor expensive solitude seemed to relieve. It was pressure like that which sat between her ribs now as she glanced again at the file in front of her. Turner v. Department of Child Welfare, re. Minor Miles Jackson. Age, 8. Previous placements, 6. Current. Foster parents, Robert and Elaine Turner. Duration of placement, 5 months. Petition, termination of foster relationship. She turned the page. No allegations of abuse, no injuries, no emergencies, just the usual language. Poor adjustment, emotional withdrawal, lack of bonding, refusal to engage in family routines. In other words, a child who had been passed from home to home like a paper bag in the wind and had the audacity not to perform gratitude on cue. A bailiff opened the side door to the courtroom. The Turners entered first, dressed in the careful way upper-middle-class couples did when they wanted to project calm respectability. Elaine in a pastel suit and string of pearls, Robert in a navy blazer, with a stiff smile pasted onto his lips. They looked like catalog models for controlled compassion, and behind them, flanked by a social worker and a case aide, came the boy. He was small for 8, wiry, his brown skin too pale around the mouth and eyes as though he hadn't eaten properly in days. He wore a faded blue sweater 2 sizes too big, the sleeves bunching at his wrists. His sneakers were scuffed and unlaced. But none of that was what struck Lacey. It was his eyes. Miles Jackson walked into her courtroom like a whisper on the wind. Silent, careful, deliberate. And then he looked up at her, just for a second. But it was enough. A glance caught her unprepared. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no cinematic music swelling in the background. But something inside her dropped. Not like a fall, more like recognition, the way you might recognize a song playing faintly on a distant radio. She blinked and looked back down at the file, heart thumping once in her throat before settling again into its cage. "Court is now in session," announced the bailiff, the Honorable Judge Harper presiding. She straightened. "We are convened for review of Dependency Case 12-0473. Petitioners Robert and Elaine Turner are present." Counsel? We're here, Your Honor, said William Crane, stepping forward. Tall, silver-haired, and impossibly smooth, Crane had made a career of representing foster parents who wanted out. We'll be brief. My clients have determined that they are not an appropriate fit for young Miles. Despite their earnest efforts, they've encountered persistent behavioral challenges that they believe make continued placement untenable. Lacey's gaze shifted to the Turners. You may speak. Elaine cleared her throat delicately. We really did try, Your Honor. We gave him every opportunity to integrate. Private school enrollment, a tutor, therapy. We bought him a new bedroom set, let him choose the colors, but he just never opened up. Robert nodded. He stares, sometimes for hours. Doesn't talk unless spoken to, and even then it's barely audible. He doesn't engage, doesn't smile. The other kids, our biological children, they're uncomfortable around him. Lacey's jaw tightened slightly. She had heard variations of this speech too many times. And you're certain termination is your preference? Elaine's lips thinned. Yes, Your Honor, for his sake and ours. Her eyes shifted to the boy, sitting quietly in the front row. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. The case aide sat close, but not touching, as though he might vanish if anyone got too close. And still, those eyes, not pleading, not begging, just waiting. Mr. Crane, Lacey said, do you have supporting documentation of the Turners' efforts? Therapist notes, school reports, incident logs? We do, Your Honor, Crane said, passing a manila folder to the clerk. Lacey accepted it. She flipped the folder open, scanning quickly. Not much stood out. Notes from a school counselor about non-responsiveness. A therapist's observation. Likely trauma-related withdrawal. Another note. Client clutches a photograph and refuses to let go. Became distressed when asked about it. Her eyes narrowed. What photograph? She asked. Elaine glanced at the boy, almost annoyed. He carries it everywhere, won't let anyone touch it, says it's his. Lacey looked again at Miles, and now she saw it, the curled edge of a folded photo sticking from his sweater pocket. He clutched it with one small hand, thumb pressed tightly across the top edge as if to shield its contents from the world. Something fluttered inside her. She pressed it down. Would the child like to speak? She asked, knowing the answer but offering the formality. No response, not even a shake of the head. Has he spoken to anyone today? She asked the social worker. No, Your Honor, said Marissa Young, a thin woman with weary eyes. He's been mute since the transport this morning. That's not unusual for him after transitions. Lacey nodded. Then we'll take a short recess before reviewing final recommendations. She stood, gathering her notes, but before she could turn to leave, a movement drew her attention. Miles had stood up. He did it slowly, almost deliberately, unfolding himself from the wooden bench like someone rising not because they were told to, but because they had decided something. He took a step forward. The courtroom held its breath. Your Honor, Crane said, starting forward, clearly ready to intercept. Let him, Lacey said quietly, raising a hand. Miles took another step, and then another. His case aide rose halfway, hesitant, unsure, but Lacey's firm look held her in place. He stopped just below the bench, tilted his chin, lifted his gaze, and then he said it. You're my mom. The words were quiet, soft, but unmistakable. They slipped through the silence of the courtroom like a match across dry kindling. Crane's mouth opened and closed. Elaine gasped. Robert muttered something sharp under his breath. Marissa Young blinked hard, her hands tightening on her notebook. The bailiff shifted in place. But Lacey was still. The boy's words hung in the air like smoke. "You're my mom," he repeated, louder now. "I know you are." The pressure in her chest rose with terrifying speed. She gripped the edge of the bench, knuckles white. Her breath came shallow, and in her mind, uninvited, came the image. A hospital room bathed in pale blue, the smell of antiseptic, the sharp pain of contractions, the doctor's grim voice, the forms she signed through tears and morphine haze. No one should have to see a dead child, they said. She hadn't. She never did. I need a recess, she managed. Her voice sounded wrong, far away, like it belonged to someone else. 10-minute recess, she declared, standing abruptly. The bailiff announced it, but no one moved. Lacey turned, walked as fast as she could without running. The heavy wooden door closed behind her with a boom that echoed deep in her bones. In the silence of her chambers, she sat down hard and let her breath come in ragged waves. Outside, the boy waited. And inside her, something had begun to crack. Judge Lacey Harper sat at the edge of the leather sofa in her chambers, the warmth of the boy's words still humming through her veins like a slow, relentless current. She hadn't moved since closing the door behind her. The room was cloaked in muffled silence, broken only by the persistent ticking of the antique clock above the bookshelf. Time, always measured, always ticking forward. But inside her, the world had stopped moving altogether. She replayed the scene over and over, the boy's small form approaching the bench, the certainty in his eyes, the quiet strength of his voice. "You're my mom." 3 words, simple and soft, but devastating in their implication. They had ripped through her like a blade through silk, parting years of carefully constructed denial. She leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees, and cradled her face in trembling hands. Miles Jackson, 8 years old, wards of the state for nearly that long. No known biological relatives. No full birth certificate on file. Only fragments of bureaucratic language that said nothing and hid everything. It had been 8 years since she gave birth in that sterile private hospital, surrounded by white coats and clipped voices. She had been vulnerable, emotionally, physically, spiritually. The complications had been sudden, the cesarean emergency, the anesthesia heavy. When she awoke, it was to a still room, a nurse with downturned eyes and a doctor delivering the news with a surgeon's detachment. The baby hadn't made it. A boy. No chance of revival. No need to see him, they'd said. It would only prolong the pain. Better to move forward. And so she had. She signed the papers, accepted the death certificate, left the hospital a week later with a hollow where her child should have been. Her husband, Jason, had been equally devastated, though he masked it with silence. He died 2 years later in a car accident, and she had buried him with the rest of her hope. What had remained was discipline, purpose, law. Now that purpose had just called her mother. She rose shakily and crossed to her desk. Her fingers hovered over the phone, then moved to the locked drawer beneath. She withdrew a slim black folder, untouched for years, and opened it with careful reverence. Inside were the echoes of her loss. The copy of the death certificate, a hospital band with her name, a tiny photo of her swollen belly taken 2 days before labor, a knitted blue cap she'd never had the chance to place on his head. She touched each item like it might vanish under her fingertips. Then, her eyes fixed on the certificate. The ink had faded slightly with time, but the details remained clear. Baby boy Harper. Born June 4th. Died June 4th. Time of death, 3:17 a.m. She checked the file again. Miles Jackson's birth date, June 4th. Her breath caught. Coincidence. It had to be. The rational part of her mind clung to it like a rope. She had seen too much, knew too much of the system's labyrinthine nature to believe in serendipity. And yet, her gut, the one she had trained so ruthlessly to ignore, whispered another truth. A soft knock at the door startled her. It opened slightly, and Marissa Young peeked inside. "Your Honor, I'm sorry, the recess is nearly over. Do you need more time?" Lacey nodded slowly. "Yes, 15 more minutes. And, Miss Young, please bring Miles to my chambers. I'd like to speak with him privately." The social worker hesitated. "Of course. Right away." The door closed again. Lacey exhaled. The decision came with risk, of course. She would need to justify it on record. Concern for the child's mental state, perhaps, or a private inquiry into placement trauma. But she no longer cared about appearances. Not now. She needed to see him, to hear him again, to try and understand what part of her life had been ripped away without her even knowing. 15 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. When the door opened again, the boy entered without prompting. He held the same photograph in his hand, now slightly more crumpled, as if it had endured a long history of clutching. Marissa remained at the door, uncertain whether to step inside. "I'll call when I'm ready," Lacey said gently. Marissa nodded, closing the door behind her. Miles stood near the coat rack, his shoulders tight, his eyes scanning the room but always returning to her. He looked smaller here, in the warm light of her chambers, dwarfed by the shelves and high-backed chairs. "You can sit," Lacey said softly, gesturing to the leather armchair across from her. He did, legs tucked up, feet dangling above the floor. He didn't speak. "I'm sorry for the way I reacted," she began. "You surprised me." Miles studied her, head tilted slightly, like a bird listening for distant thunder. "Do you remember when you first saw me?" she asked. "Why you said what you said?" He nodded slowly. "I just knew. I saw your eyes." "My eyes?" "They're the same as mine." Lacey's throat constricted. She couldn't look away from him, the shape of his jaw, the curve of his brow, the stubborn set of his mouth. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't fantasy. She had seen hundreds of children in her courtroom, but none had ever looked at her with such wordless familiarity. "Can I see the photo?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then, slowly, he extended it to her. Lacey unfolded it carefully. It was grainy, printed on cheap paper, possibly from an old digital camera. It showed a woman sitting on a hospital bed, one hand resting on her round belly. Her hair was pulled back and her face was flushed but smiling. It was her, 8 years ago, in the maternity wing of St. Anthony's. She remembered that day. Jason had taken the picture. She had never printed it. Her hand trembled. "Where did you get this?" Miles looked down. "A lady gave it to me when I was little." "What lady?" "I don't remember her name. She was in one of the houses. Said you were my real mom. Told me to never forget." Lacey felt the room tilt, her hands pressed into the arms of her chair. "Do you remember what she looked like?" "Brown skin, old, hair like snow. She smelled like flowers and books." Lacey closed her eyes. Somewhere in the haze of grief, bureaucracy, and betrayal, a crack had opened wide enough for a miracle, or a conspiracy, to slip through. She opened her eyes again. "You said I'm your mom," she said carefully. "How do you know? Really know?" Miles didn't blink. "Because I remember your heartbeat." A pause. "When? When I was little, before, inside. I remember the sound." Lacey inhaled sharply, unprepared for the way his words struck her. They were impossible, ridiculous, and yet she had sung to him every night in those last weeks, a lullaby her mother used to hum to her. She remembered lying in bed, cradling her belly, whispering words of comfort to the life she thought would soon begin. Miles spoke again. "You sang," he said, "about the stars and the wind." Lacey's fingers dug into the arms of the chair. She felt tears prick the corners of her eyes and bit the inside of her cheek to hold them back. "That song," she said hoarsely. "Do you remember the words?" He nodded. "Can you sing it?" he began softly. A child's broken melody, off-key, hesitant, but unmistakable. Her breath left her in a slow, shuddering exhale. When the final note died in the silence, she could no longer deny it. She rose, walked around the desk, and knelt beside him. Carefully, so carefully, she reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. "I need to find out the truth," she whispered. "Would you help me?" He nodded once. She stood, crossed to her desk, and picked up her phone. The number she dialed was burned into memory, the only private investigator she had ever trusted. The voice that answered was brisk, male. "Chen," it said. "Dimitri, it's Harper." A pause. "What is it?" "I need you to find everything you can on a boy named Miles Jackson. 8 years old, placement history, birth records, hospital transfers, foster agencies, everything." There was another pause. "This personal?" "Yes." He didn't ask further. "I'll get started." Lacey hung up and turned to Miles. "I don't know what we'll find," she said, "but I promise I'll protect you." He nodded again, and then, for the first time, leaned slightly toward her. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder. Outside the chambers, the world waited. Inside, something lost had been found. And somewhere, deep within her, the silence had finally begun to break. The days that followed felt like walking through water, thick, slow, uncertain. Judge Lacey Harper moved through her courtroom with the same mechanical grace she had honed over years, but something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The stern precision of her rulings, once unquestionable, now felt like porcelain, presentable but fragile, liable to crack under the pressure of the truth clawing its way into the light. She no longer saw just cases or files. She saw potential stories, stolen names, rewritten truths, quiet tragedies wrapped in manila folders. She saw Miles, seated on the edge of her guest bed with a book too large for his lap, eyes scanning lines that seemed to root him to safety. He was now staying with her temporarily, under the pretext of emergency placement. It raised eyebrows, of course, but she knew how to thread the language to make it stick, for now. He barely spoke during meals. She didn't push. Instead, she created an atmosphere where silence was not feared but allowed. The boy needed space. What she didn't anticipate was how much she needed it too. The presence of him in her house cracked something open in her, something she had buried beneath years of controlled grief and judicial detachment. She hadn't thought about lullabies or night feedings in years. Now she found herself listening for his breathing in the next room. She'd linger outside his door and sometimes find herself humming the song he'd remembered, her mother's song, their song. The first major breakthrough came from Dimitri Chen 3 days later. He arrived at her house late in the evening, his coat soaked from rain, a flash drive in hand and eyes shadowed by disbelief. "You're going to want to sit down," he said before even stepping inside. Lacey did, and he pulled out a laptop from his bag, inserted the drive, and brought up a folder labeled Miles_Jackson _origins. Inside were files, some official, some barely legible, scanned notes, old adoption agency forms, and something that made her blood run cold. A second death certificate. This one listed the same date and time as her son's supposed death, but with a different name attached. Miles Anthony Harper. This came from a data cache pulled from a server linked to a defunct adoption agency called Future Pathways, Dimitri said. It was shut down 5 years ago after allegations of paperwork fraud, but no convictions were made. Most of their files were lost in a warehouse fire. "How did you get this?" Lacey asked, voice brittle. "Let's say I know someone who knows where digital ghosts hide." She scrolled further. The agency had forged multiple birth certificates for Miles, each one with slightly different parental information. His initial placement had been with a family in Nebraska who returned him within 2 months, citing behavioral irregularities. No questions asked. After that, he ping-ponged across 6 states. Each time a new name, a new background story, and no clear medical trail. Every time a little more of his identity eroded. "There's more," Dimitri said, opening another file. This was a hospital log from St. Anthony's Medical Center, where she had delivered 8 years ago. The page had been buried under layers of encrypted data. It showed a live birth at 3:04 a.m. The attending physician's note read, "Infant breathing stabilized, transferred to neonatal observation." 30 minutes later, the record stopped. No discharge summary. No time of death. Just silence. Lacey stared at the screen, the cursor blinking at the edge of the note as if waiting for her to write the next line of truth. "They took him," she whispered. Dimitri's silence confirmed it. "But why?" she asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. "What would be the motive?" He hesitated. "Because you were perfect." "What?" "A respected black female judge, educated, healthy, no extended family interference, newly widowed. You fit the exact criteria outlined in a secondary file I found. Candidates for clean infant extraction. Ideal donor mothers for wealthy clientele who wanted children with high genetic potential, but no complications or biological interference." Lacey recoiled as though struck. "You're saying I was targeted?" He nodded. "I believe you were a part of something much larger." The bile rose in her throat. It all aligned. The sedation, the dissuasion from seeing her child, the rushed paperwork, the insistence on grief management through closure. Her world had been a theater stage where the performance was her pain, and the real show had been happening in the background. She closed the laptop with shaking hands. "This has to stop, not just for me, for every other mother this happened to." Dimitri looked at her grim. "Then we go public, but carefully. And you'll need protection. These people, this network, they're not just unethical. They're powerful. Medical, judicial, financial connections, deep." The next week was a blur of planning and caution. They began compiling every piece of evidence Dimitri could recover. Financial ledgers, falsified birth certificates, names of ghost physicians and long-silent nurses. But most alarming were the references to repeat adopters, wealthy families who had taken in multiple infants. Some returned quietly, some never spoken of again. There were whispers of a market, disguised as compassion. At the heart of it all was a buried truth. Black and brown babies were more frequently misplaced, declared dead, or untraceably rerouted through broken foster channels than any others. Lacey had seen the statistics. She'd read the reports. But now those numbers had a face, a voice. Her son. One of Dimitri's contacts, a whistleblower who had once worked in an affiliated hospital, agreed to meet. Her name was Yolanda Pierce. She was in her 60s now, retired, but she still had a meticulous memory and a guilty conscience. They met in a small church hall on the edge of town. Yolanda's hands trembled as she poured coffee. "I remember your case," she said, her voice cracking. "They called you Package 12. That's what the administrator said. Said the Harper file was a clean handoff. I didn't understand what it meant at the time, but later I saw the baby, healthy, crying, and I saw a nurse take him out the back, not to the NICU. That's when I knew something was wrong." "Why didn't you speak up?" Lacey asked. "I tried," Yolanda whispered. "They reassigned me, said I was unstable. I lost my job a year later, thought I was crazy, until now." The meeting ended with Yolanda handing over a worn notebook filled with coded observations, names, dates, and initials. It was the kind of document no court would accept, but every truth seeker needed. Back home, Lacey held the notebook in one hand and watched Miles asleep on the couch, a book resting on his chest. His face was relaxed, but in the furrow of his brow she saw the cost of being unchosen again and again. A child who had been told, directly or indirectly, that he was too much, too broken, too silent, too loud. The next morning, she filed a private motion with the family court clerk, using an obscure judicial channel few knew existed, one meant for safeguarding vulnerable minors but open to interpretation. She marked it with her judge's seal and the notation, "Review of identity and parental assignment pending new evidence." It was the first formal step, a quiet crack in the legal machine. In her office, she began pulling other case files, ones that hadn't sat right over the years. Children disappeared into institutional loops. Placements reversed for vague behavioral issues. Files with blank sections that no one could explain. Her staff began to notice. Whispers began to spread. One afternoon, a clerk approached her quietly. Young, brown-skinned, anxious. "Judge Harper, I think I saw a case like that last year. A little girl. Same story. Mother said her child was alive. Hospital said otherwise. Bring me everything," Lacey said. And they did, case after case. Ghost children and grieving parents, all hidden behind a veil of bureaucratic silence. The machine was large, but it was starting to hum. The danger was growing too. Dimitri reported surveillance. Yolanda's mailbox was torn open. Lacey noticed unfamiliar cars parked too long outside her home. But she kept going. She had to. One night, Miles came into her room, clutching his blanket. "I had the dream again," he whispered. She pulled him into bed beside her, holding him close. "Tell me." "They were taking me, away from the light, away from you, but I screamed this time. I screamed your name." Lacey stroked his hair, her heart heavy with a mix of pride and sorrow. "You're safe now. I promise you." The moonlight streamed through the window. Outside, the world kept its secrets. But inside, the chains were breaking. One by one. The names were still buried, but not for long. The morning sunlight that filtered through Judge Lacey Harper's window carried the illusion of peace, a golden stillness that did not reflect the storm she felt rising inside her. For the first time in nearly a decade, she was living in the same house as her son, her real son, and yet the moment was complicated, fragile, draped in legal uncertainties and emotional unknowns. Each time she looked at Miles, she felt both the comfort of recognition and the haunting ache of everything they'd lost. She watched him now, curled up on the sofa in the sunroom, a pencil in his hand and a blank sketchbook resting on his knees. He wasn't drawing yet. He was thinking, eyes darting to the window and then back to the page. The boy was always thinking. Lacey had come to learn that he carried the world in his silence. It wasn't detachment. It was the burden of memory. Her phone buzzed with a new message from Dmitri. It's time. That afternoon, she and Dmitri sat across from Special Agent Miriam Graves of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The woman was lean, sharp-eyed, and wore her badge like a blade. She had already read through the files, Yolanda's notebook, the altered birth certificates. She'd also reviewed the private motion Lacey had filed with the court, a bold move given the implications. This won't be easy, Graves said, her voice measured but clear. You're talking about exposing a multi-state trafficking network using hospitals and state systems to reroute children, most of them black or brown, into privatized adoption markets. And you're implicating licensed physicians, judges, and agency heads in a criminal conspiracy. I'm not talking, Lacey replied, her tone as solid as her bench. I'm showing. Graves gave a slow nod. We'll open an investigation, but we need a name. One name to start, one we can turn. Dmitri leaned forward. Try Jennifer Mallory. She worked at Future Pathways and took early retirement 6 years ago. We have documents with her initials on several falsified records. We'll find her, Graves promised. The following days moved like gears grinding into motion. The FBI began issuing quiet subpoenas, opening sealed files, and tracing the financial trails Dmitri had uncovered. Lacey coordinated from the shadows, no longer acting as judge in the court of law, but very much presiding in the court of truth. She stepped down temporarily from her docket, citing a personal matter. The press speculated, but no one guessed the truth. Not yet. She and Miles settled into a rhythm. In the evenings, she cooked. He helped set the table. There were still long silences, but now they were soft, healing silences. He was beginning to draw again. Sketches of trees, faces, shadowed hallways. One day, she found a drawing of a crib, simple, with a name carved faintly along the edge. Milo. It was the name she had chosen for him before birth. Miles, she whispered as she held the drawing. Is that? He nodded without looking up. I remembered it. In a dream. A whisper. It was more than a name. It was a thread. They spent one afternoon organizing the evidence into binders, labeled by hospital, by agency, by child. It was Miles who carefully placed sticky notes on key pages. He remembered faces, rooms, pieces of conversations. He remembered what the adults around him assumed he would forget. Lacey watched him move with quiet purpose, and her heart swelled with an ache too wide for words. This boy, discarded by so many, was reconstructing an empire of truth brick by brick. She could see it in his every movement. He wasn't just surviving. He was building. And for the first time, he wasn't building alone. One evening, Agent Graves returned with news. We found Jennifer Mallory. She said she's agreed to talk, in exchange for protection. She has names, payment records, emails. She kept everything. Why? Lacey asked, suspicious. Graves shrugged. Guilt, maybe. Or fear. Or both. But it gets deeper. She says the original list of extraction candidates came from an algorithm developed by a data analysis firm subcontracted by the Department of Health. Mothers were chosen based on predictive markers, trauma history, income bracket, lack of next of kin. So it was systemic, Lacey said, her voice low. Worse, it was engineered. The word chilled her to the bone. Engineered, not accidental, not individual corruption. Designed. Mallory claims there was a primary list, a Tier 1 list, for clean acquisitions. Was I on it? Lacey asked. Graves nodded. Top 5. The air left the room. She stared at the floor, her thoughts spiraling through years of silence, grief, and the calculated theft of her motherhood. And suddenly, she understood something profound. Her son was not just stolen. He was cataloged, filed, priced. The next day, Miles asked to go with her to the courthouse. "Are you sure?" she asked. He nodded. She dressed him carefully in a collared shirt and slacks, not because she cared about the image, but because she knew how the world saw young black boys, especially in courtrooms, especially when they were brave enough to speak. The hearing was closed to the public. It was a review session, pending confirmation of new evidence regarding his identity. Judge Pearson, an older black woman with tired eyes, presided. Lacey stood not as a judge, but as a petitioner. Miles stood beside her. The moment felt like the mirror of that day weeks ago when he had spoken those 4 words and cracked open the universe. Now he had more to say. He took the stand with solemn grace. He answered every question with clarity. When asked why he believed Lacey was his mother, he listed details, memories, songs, the shape of her hands, the scent of her sweater, the sound of her voice in dreams. Then he pulled from his pocket the same faded photograph he had carried from foster home to foster home. He handed it to the bailiff, who gave it to the judge. Pearson studied it. Her eyes softened. "That's you," she said, almost involuntarily. "Yes," Miles replied, "and that's her." He pointed to Lacey. "And I never forgot her face." The silence that followed was not empty. It was holy. When the court recessed, Pearson pulled Lacey aside. "You know they'll come after you." "I know." "They'll try to paint you as unstable, compromised." "I'm ready." Pearson held her gaze. "Then go get them." The official ruling was pending DNA confirmation, but the court allowed Miles to remain with Lacey indefinitely under special guardianship. They walked out of the courtroom hand in hand, into the blinding sun and the blur of flashing cameras. Somehow, the world had found out. Whispers turned into headlines. Judge Harper's secret son. Stolen black children. The baby who spoke the truth. That night, they sat on the porch, the sky stitched with stars. "You were amazing," she said. He shrugged, a little bashful. "I just told the truth. Sometimes that's the bravest thing we can do." He leaned against her. "Will other kids get to go home too?" She nodded. "We're going to make sure of it." The wind rustled the trees. Tomorrow would bring subpoenas, backlash, interviews. But tonight there was peace. A name remembered, a truth rising, and a promise yet to keep. Miles had not spoken much the morning after the court hearing, but his silence no longer felt like fear. It was something quieter, deeper, reflection tempered with the slow, deliberate awakening of a boy no longer lost. He sat on the edge of the porch with a cup of cocoa in his hand, feet swinging above the grass, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if watching for a sunrise that had already come. Lacey watched him from inside the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug she had barely touched. The house had changed, or maybe it was she who had changed. The rooms, once clinical and still, now held the rhythm of 2 heartbeats. The sharp edges of solitude had softened. A pair of sneakers lay abandoned near the door. A coat too small for her hung next to her own, and on the fridge, held up by a magnet from a legal conference in D.C., a charcoal drawing of a tree, Miles's tree, its roots curling like questions into the earth. She joined him outside. They didn't speak. There was no need to. In that shared quiet there was a growing trust, fragile but real. It had not erased the scars of abandonment, the confusion, or the pain of years lost. But it offered something more powerful than forgetting, the promise of remembering together. That afternoon, the storm broke, not in the skies above, which remained stubbornly blue and warm, but in the world beyond their street. The media had seized the story with hungry ferocity. A local news station ran a segment titled, "From the Bench to the Cradle, the Judge and the Boy." A national outlet followed suit with far less tact. Black boy calls white judge mom in stunning courtroom twist. The headlines trended for all the wrong reasons, tangled in sensationalism, stripped of dignity. Lacey's phone lit up with messages, some from old colleagues, others from strangers, and many from voices she thought she'd never hear again. Some messages were supportive, even emotional. Others were venomous. She didn't let Miles see them. The backlash came as she knew it would. Editorials accused her of exploiting a child to gain attention. Anonymous online forums labeled her unfit. A conservative blog published her hospital records from 8 years prior, questioning the legitimacy of her claim to motherhood. They called the situation theatrical, unverified, dangerous precedent. They said she was imagining grief where none had a right to exist. But none of them had looked into Miles's eyes and seen the truth that lived there. None of them had heard him whisper the word "Mom," as if the earth had finally stilled beneath his feet. Dimitri worked double time to secure their case. He tracked down more names: doctors, administrators, court officers who had worked with Future Pathways and similar agencies. Through encrypted sources, he obtained a trove of emails detailing years of transactions between the adoption network and third-party recruiters. They'd sold infants like property, laundering identities through falsified records, sometimes even changing ethnic markers on paperwork to increase a child's market value. Children, like Miles, had not merely been misplaced, they had been erased, rewritten. Lacey stared at the files, each name a betrayal, each document another indictment. She saw her own initials again, scrawled in a transfer form from 8 years ago. Her hands trembled. It had been her signature, except it wasn't. The forgery was near perfect, but not perfect enough. The Y in her name curled the wrong way. The date was off by 1 day. Someone had forged her consent to release a newborn child. They'd used her grief to mask the crime, and now the truth was boiling to the surface. Meanwhile, Miles continued to unfold himself like a page long crumpled. He began to speak more often, not all the time, but when it mattered. He asked questions about her childhood, about his father, about why people were angry that he had come home. "Is it because I'm black?" he asked one night, lying curled on the sofa while the television murmured about the hearing. The question cracked her open. She sat beside him, heart pounding. "Some people," she said carefully, "don't understand what love really means. They think families have to look one way." "But I don't look like you," he said. "No," she whispered. "You look like you." He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I used to dream my mom looked like me. But then I started dreaming of your voice, the song, and I thought, maybe love isn't about matching. Maybe it's about remembering." She pulled him into her arms. Later that week, Agent Graves called. "We're ready to move forward. The rests begin tomorrow morning. You'll need to stay put. Media will go wild, but we have enough to proceed." Lacey hung up and stared at the floor. She thought of the women she'd seen in family court, sobbing, screaming, begging for their children, women whose cases had been dismissed as unfit, uncooperative, or simply inconvenient. How many of them had told the truth? How many had been silenced by a system that pretended to know best? The next morning, the country woke up to a reckoning. Federal agents raided 3 hospitals, 2 adoption agencies, and 1 courthouse. 5 doctors were arrested, 3 agency directors, and 1 retired judge. The news cameras swarmed. Protesters gathered. Some held signs that read, "Not one more." Others waved copies of Miles's photo, calling him the boy who remembered. Miles watched the coverage from their living room, sitting quietly beside her, his fingers curled around the same old photograph. "That's her," he said suddenly, pointing to one of the nurses being escorted out in handcuffs. "That's the one who told me my real mom gave me away. She said it was better for everyone." Lacey's breath caught. He added, almost absently, "She used to say brown boys didn't get picked unless they were quiet." It was not just a memory. It was an indictment. That night, Lacey received a call from Miriam Graves. "We found the original intake logs," Graves said. 37 children from 1 hospital, all removed within the same 2-year window. Most were marked as unclaimed. Many of the mothers had filed reports, but those files were lost, deleted, or sealed. "And the ones who filed those reports?" Lacey asked. "Some are still searching," Graves said. "Others gave up. A few never stopped. We're reaching out to each one, offering to run DNA tests. If they match, we'll start reunification." Lacey hung up the phone and turned to look at Miles, who was now asleep on the couch, his head resting on her old law school hoodie. The house was silent, but in that silence lived the weight of memory, not a burden, a responsibility. That night, Lacey wrote a letter, not to the media, not to the court, but to the mothers whose children were stolen, and to the children who grew up not knowing they had been stolen. She wrote of silence and courage, of broken systems and the slow repair. She wrote of Miles, of the way he had said her name not as a question, but as a truth. She wrote that healing was not linear, that justice was not instant, but both were still possible. She ended the letter with 1 sentence: "We remember you." And in the flickering glow of a desk lamp, she sealed the envelope and whispered a promise to the night. They would not forget. They would not stop. Because memory, like love, was stronger than silence. And the boy who remembered had already changed everything. Lacey sat alone at the long dining table, her hands resting lightly on the worn wood that bore the faint stains of a childhood that had never come to pass. No spilled juice, no finger paints, no scuffed math books. For years, the table had been a monument to absence. But now it was cluttered with documents, manila folders, and hastily scribbled notes. The silence of the house was no longer oppressive. It had become anticipatory. Miles was upstairs asleep, his breathing light and rhythmic behind the door she left ajar. She listened for it every night now, not because she feared it would stop, but because she had learned to cherish it. The previous week had unfolded like a slow earthquake, one that rumbled beneath the surface until it split through every layer of comfort and custom. The raids had shaken the country. Arrests had made headlines. But what followed next was not closure. It was confrontation. Graves had called earlier that day with an urgent tone that Lacey had not yet heard in the agent's typically clipped voice. They had found something, more than something. An archive, a hidden ledger of transactions from future pathways and several affiliated clinics. Unlike the carefully scrubbed data found in public records, this was private, raw, unredacted, handwritten. Lacey studied the scanned copies now, each line an unbearable truth. Names, dates, false birth certificates, coded references to race, medical history, and placement suitability. One column read project integrity, another asset suitability. What chilled her most were the initials next to certain names: Judges, doctors, social workers. Some she recognized, some she had once trusted. There were also comments in the margins, clinical and cold. Too vocal, delay placement. Mother grieving, disengaged quickly. Potential liability sent through secondary agency. It was not just a pipeline, it was an industry. The documents painted a timeline of orchestrated deceit, beginning long before Miles had been born. The targeting of vulnerable women had been systemic, often focusing on Black and Latina mothers who lacked family networks or resources. Lacey read page after page describing how infants had been removed after births labeled traumatic. In nearly all cases, the mothers had been sedated. Most had never held their children. Her own file was among them. Not a copy she recognized. This one bore the emblem of a now-defunct medical services provider, a contract group hired by the hospital. The birth report had been falsified. A forged note of respiratory failure, followed by deceased upon arrival to NICU. But the timestamp was almost identical to the one on the surveillance photo of Miles being carried through the hallway. He hadn't died, he had been moved. And now, in black and white, she held the evidence that others had known and signed. Graves arrived just before dawn, her trench coat damp with the spring drizzle that had swept through the city overnight. She looked tired but resolute. She carried a flash drive, several sealed evidence bags, and a clipboard thick with authorization forms. "We're filing formal charges," she said without preamble. "The FBI has agreed to open a federal inquiry into interagency collusion. Your testimony will be key, Lacey." Lacey nodded, her throat dry. Graves hesitated. "There's more. We've identified over 80 children who were processed through the same chain of custody. 22 have already been matched through DNA outreach. Parents thought their babies died. Hospitals confirmed those deaths. All lies." They sat together at the table, the rain tapping gently against the windows. Graves laid out a map covered in red pins that represented each case of suspected fraudulent separation. The majority clustered around 3 urban centers. One of them was their own city. "They called it compassionate intervention," Graves said. "They told judges and doctors it was about placing unwanted children in loving homes." "They told the mothers nothing," Lacey said bitterly. "No," Graves replied, "they told them silence." Over the following days, the operation expanded. The press, already saturated with speculation, began to dig deeper. One investigative journalist published a series of exposés revealing connections between agency executives and political donors. Another traced offshore accounts tied to key hospital administrators. The narrative was no longer about a courtroom revelation. It had become a national scandal. Yet for Lacey and Miles, the heart of it was personal. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Miles unfolded another drawing. This time it was a series of faces, some unfinished, others shaded carefully. "These are the kids from the house," he said softly. "The ones from before." He pointed at one. "Her name was Tasha. She used to hum at night so we wouldn't be scared." "Do you know where she is now?" Lacey asked gently. Miles shook his head. "They took her when she got too loud. She used to scream when they turned off the lights." Lacey closed her eyes. Another name, another child lost in the system. They began compiling a list. Graves and her team cross-referenced it with placement records, many of which had been falsified. The trail led them to warehouses, to transfer centers disguised as community housing, to rural group homes with little oversight. The stories they uncovered mirrored one another. Children told they were abandoned, punished for asking about their families, relocated when they began to remember. Lacey volunteered to help with the outreach. She offered her home as a neutral meeting space for families in the process of reunification. One woman arrived carrying a photograph of her son, now a teenager living in the foster care 2 states away. Another wept into Lacey's arms when DNA confirmed her daughter had never been stillborn. The house became a sanctuary of unraveling and repair. But not everyone welcomed the truth. There were lawsuits, institutions scrambling for damage control. One hospital released a statement blaming rogue actors within their maternity division. Another flatly denied any wrongdoing. A prominent judge, once an ally of Lacey's, publicly condemned her for abandoning judicial impartiality. "You're making a circus of justice," he had said. "No," she had replied, "I'm pulling back the curtain." And through it all, Miles grew. Not in inches, though he was taller now, but in voice and presence. He no longer flinched at sudden sounds. He smiled more. He began attending a small private school with trauma-informed educators. His drawings became bolder, richer in color. He made a friend, another boy adopted with questions of his own. They played in the yard for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes in bursts of laughter that echoed into the dusk. One evening, as Lacey stood at the sink washing dishes, Miles came up behind her and slipped a folded paper into her back pocket. She dried her hands, opened it, and stared. It was a drawing of a courtroom. She stood behind the bench. Miles stood in the center, holding her hand. Above them, written in capital letters with careful strokes, were the words, "I found you." She turned and pulled him close. The storm had not passed. More revelations waited. More battles loomed. But they were not walking through it alone. And with every step forward, the system that once thrived in silence began to fracture. Because of one boy who remembered, and one woman who refused to look away. Lacey Monroe stood on the steps of the courthouse, the spring sunlight filtering through the courthouse columns like a benediction. The building that once represented routine and impartiality had transformed into the stage for one of the most consequential legal reckonings in decades. Its marble facade, once sterile, now seemed almost trembling under the weight of the truth being spoken within. Reporters gathered outside like birds on wire, murmuring into microphones, broadcasting every breath of the proceedings. But Lacey's attention was elsewhere, on the boy beside her, his small hand wrapped tightly in hers. Miles had chosen to wear the same navy sweater he'd worn the day he first said it. The sleeves were a little shorter now, his wrists peeked out from under the cuffs. He was growing quickly, shedding the skin of fear and replacing it with something solid and whole. His grip was firm, not from anxiety but from clarity. He knew why they were here, and he wanted to be part of it. Inside, the courtroom was already filled. The gallery was dense with families, some reunited, some still waiting. There were lawyers and advocates, federal agents and state investigators. There were former hospital employees called to testify, agency directors in expensive suits whose faces twitched as evidence was introduced. But all of them fell silent when the judge entered, the same solemn ritual that had once defined Lacey's own career. She did not sit on the bench this time. She was seated at the front alongside federal attorneys and survivors, a witness among the wounded. The final phase of the investigation had culminated in this: a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of more than 100 families whose children had been illegally separated, trafficked, and silenced. The charges ranged from medical fraud to civil rights violations to criminal conspiracy. It was no longer a question of whether something terrible had happened. It was about who had known, who had profited, and who would finally be held accountable. As the first testimonies began, Lacey listened with a calm that was not detachment, but resolve. She had heard much of this already, through reports, interviews, late-night phone calls with Graves. But here, under oath, each word held a new kind of power. There was the mother who had been told her baby died after birth, only to find her daughter alive 16 years later. There was the nurse who had delivered dozens of infants to alternative care facilities without ever seeing their mothers again. There was a social worker who admitted she'd flagged suspicious patterns in placement files, only to be reassigned when she asked too many questions. Then it was Lacey's turn. She rose slowly, every eye in the room following her as she walked toward the witness stand. The bailiff swore her in, and she took her seat, the polished wood cool beneath her fingertips. She could feel Miles watching her from the gallery. His presence steadied her. The prosecutor asked her to recount her own story, not as a judge, not as an expert, but as a mother. She spoke clearly, without theatrics. She described her pregnancy, the complications, the birth. The moment they told her her son had died. The months and years that followed, empty, heavy with questions no one dared to ask. And then, the day the boy walked into her courtroom with a crumpled photo and a voice that cracked the world open. She described the evidence they'd uncovered together, the falsified documents, the secret transfers, the coordinated silencing of dissent. She named names. She explained how systems had been built to fail people like her, like Miles, like the dozens of mothers and children who now sat trembling in the audience, clutching one another's hands. When she finished, there was no applause, only a silence so deep it seemed to echo. The judge presiding over the case, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair and an unflinching gaze, thanked her, then turned to the defense. The cross-examination was measured, respectful. They tried to suggest that Lacey's grief may have clouded her memory, that emotional trauma might render certain details unreliable. But each time Lacey responded with calm precision, her answers rooted in documentation, her pain tempered by truth. She did not waver. She did not retreat. And when she stepped down from the stand, her steps were slow but unshaken. In the days that followed, the court heard more testimony. Experts confirmed the medical impossibility of the recorded causes of death. Forensic accountants traced wire transfers to dummy corporations linked to adoption brokers. Whistleblowers described incentive programs, bonuses tied to expedited placements, internal codes used to mark desirable infants. A former executive admitted, flatly, that race had played a factor in marketability assessments. Black babies were often placed in riskier homes, where oversight was minimal and financial return was lower. It was a horror not of shadows but of spreadsheets. The verdict, when it came, was sweeping. Multiple agencies were found guilty of systemic negligence and intentional fraud. Several hospital administrators were indicted. Civil settlements reached into the hundreds of millions. But for Lacey, justice was never going to be about money. It was about reclamation, of history, of dignity, of truth. Federal legislation followed quickly. A new bill was introduced in Congress, the Future Families Protection Act, designed to overhaul oversight in adoption practices, regulate hospital reporting procedures, and fund support services for survivors of illegal separation. Lacey testified before the Senate committee, her words broadcast to millions. She held up a photograph of Miles, the same one he had carried into her courtroom, and said, "This is the face that reminded me who I am. This is the face that changed everything." In the months that followed, she helped establish a national task force, Justice for the Forgotten. It became a nexus for survivors, advocates, and reformers. They created a national registry for families seeking reunification. They partnered with DNA testing companies to offer free kits. They launched educational programs for judges, medical staff, and social workers. Lacey's days became a blur of meetings and interviews. She received letters from across the country, some from mothers still hoping, others from children unsure how to take the first step. She read every word. She answered every one she could. She traveled to conferences, gave speeches, sat in support groups. But she always came home to Miles. Their house was no longer quiet. On weekends, it filled with children, some still in foster care, some reunited with family, some simply drawn to a place where they were understood. Lacey and Miles hosted storytelling nights, where kids could share memories or draw pictures of the families they dreamed about. They called it Circle of the Found. One evening, as summer approached, Miles sat beside her on the back porch, watching the fireflies blink across the yard. He leaned against her shoulder and whispered, "Do you think they'll stop doing it now? Taking kids." Lacey looked up at the stars, her heart aching with the enormity of the question. "I think we made it a lot harder for them," she said softly, "and I think every time we tell the truth, we make it harder still." He nodded, then added, "Maybe I can help other kids find their moms, too." "You already are," she said, wrapping an arm around him. The night deepened. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car passed. But on the porch, the silence was peaceful, earned. Later that year, they returned to the courtroom where it had all begun. This time, not for a trial, but for an adoption. Lacey had filed the paperwork months earlier, not because she needed it to feel like Miles was hers, but because she wanted to give him what had been stolen: a name, a home, a legal truth to match the real one. Miles stood before the judge with a quiet smile. He wore a button-down shirt and the same sneakers he refused to part with. Lacey held his hand. The judge asked if he understood what the adoption meant. Miles nodded. "She's already my mom," he said. "This just makes it official." Everyone laughed. The judge signed the papers, and the courtroom erupted into a gentle round of applause. Outside, the press was waiting again. But this time, Lacey didn't feel the weight of it. She lifted Miles into a hug, spinning him once before setting him down. Then she turned to the cameras and said simply, "We found each other, and now we help others do the same." The story of one boy's voice had become a movement, and somewhere out there, in the quiet rooms of frightened children and grieving mothers, that voice still echoed. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. We are coming for you. We are bringing you home. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch our other videos to hear more powerful stories that matter. And don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to hear it.